All right, so we are here today to walk you through the new 2017 PDD contract template. Our hope is that this session will provide you detailed information about the new PDD contract template, and that when you finish this session, whether joining us remotely or in person, that you will understand the key concepts and provisions in the new contract template. We also want to be able to answer questions that you might have about how those provisions will be applied in practice, recognizing that the letter of the provisions themselves in the contract may differ from how those are actually put into place in practice. And you'll hear Tim and I speaking a lot about how practice and good relationships and collaboration really are the focus of our continued work with service providers. And the template really is a place to reference those more exceptional circumstances. So we'll speak a little bit more about that as we go. We also hope that this session provides you information about next steps so that you know what to expect in the coming weeks leading up to April 1st implementation of the new template. And finally, should you have more questions or require further information, we hope that this session provides you some guidance about who you might be able to direct those questions to. So a little bit of context, as most of you are likely aware, in the spring of 2016, Human Services introduced a new common suite of contract templates, and that was 5 contract templates covering our breadth of programs and services to replace over 50 templates that were previously in circulation across the ministry. We heard loud and clear, as Minister Sabir mentioned, from our PDD contracted service providers that the original template contained some significant flaws. Based on that feedback from the sector, he made a decision to defer implementation of the new template to April 1st, 2017, and asked that a PDD contract template committee be established to jointly develop a new contract. Tim and I participated in that table, along with one other representative from the Ministry of then Human Services. From the PDD sector, we had 4 service providers participate in those discussions, as well as the Alberta Council of Disability Services. So over the course of 8 months, we worked together over many meetings, many discussions to jointly develop a new contract template that was presented to Minister Sabir in late November of 2016 and accepted and approved by him in early this year in 2017. And that's why we're here today, and that's why Tim and I have been traveling around the province and delivering information sessions to try to support the rollout and implementation of the new contract template. Now, we've been asked why the need for change. We had a contract template that, from a service provider perspective, seemed to meet their needs. This is something that we discussed at length with the negotiating table, and really a few reasons for creating a new template. First and foremost, from a human services perspective, we needed to align the PDD contract template with the rest of our contract templates. This was partly a product of Human Services coming together in 2011 as 5 different departments. And as you can imagine, each of those departments or programs brought with it very different approaches to managing contracts and grants. And that was supported by different templates, different tools, and really a fundamentally different approach to relationship between the ministry and its service providers. So we wanted to promote a unified ministry approach, and we also needed to address feedback that we'd heard from service providers, particularly those who contract with us across multiple programs. And that feedback suggested that we were creating some significant burden for service providers in managing multiple reporting and monitoring requirements, creating some confusion in the different templates and processes that were used, and we needed to do better to align our approach and our templates and tools to support that. We also needed to align better with Government of Alberta standards, particularly around promoting greater accountability for the use of public funds and greater transparency in reporting on how those funds are used. We also needed to better ensure that government's ethical obligations to its clients are met, and that legislative requirements that govern contract and grant management, such as the Financial Administration Act and the Government Organization Amendment Act, are adhered to. The best way that we have to describe our experience over the last 8 months with the PDD Contract Template Committee was really an exercise in balance. And important through the discussions, and we continue to circle back to this as a negotiating table, was that the Albertan needed to be at the center of those discussions, and that the interests of the client or the Albertan receiving services needed to be paramount through our negotiations. So from a service provider perspective, we heard that flexibility around managing your operations and sustainability in terms of predictability of funding were very important. From a government perspective, as I've mentioned, accountability for the use of public funds and transparency for how those funds are used and reported to support better outcomes for Albertans was also critical. I do want to take this opportunity just to acknowledge that you likely have initial reactions to the template. I suspect that you've all had an initial read through the template. I suspect that not all of those reactions are positive, and that probably goes for service providers and for our contracting staff. And I would say that is truly the result of our best efforts as a negotiating table and really a function of a negotiation. So over the course of the last 8 months, we had significant discussion that led to compromise, deliberation about interests, and ultimately brought us to the contract template that we have in front of us. It was an incredible learning experience, I would say, for all parties. And today we are really past the point of debating the merits of the contract template. Our focus today is really to provide information and support to service providers and to staff to make this implementation and rollout of the new template as smooth and as successful as possible. Our next priority, once these sessions wrap up, is really working with regional contracting staff to support greater consistency in terms of how these provisions are applied and interpreted in practice. I would also say, and you'll hear us mention this throughout the session, that by its very nature, the contract covers exceptional circumstances. That is what a contract needs to do, whether it's between government or other entities. So while the letter of the provisions in the contract may seem a bit intimidating, may seem a bit harsh, they are again intended to cover those very worst case scenarios that we encounter rarely, if ever, in the course of our business together between government and contracted service providers. This is fundamentally about a contract that can support collaborative relationships and can support the ongoing dialogue and great work that you do together in our regions to deliver services to Albertans. So a quick overview of the agenda. We have broken this session into 5 modules. I'm just now about to complete the first one. I'd then we'll pause briefly for questions, and then I'd like to go through the contract template provision by provision. And this is where it will be important to have that template in front of you. Some of those provisions I'll move through quite quickly and just highlight them, and that's because Tim will be dedicating a significant amount of time in later modules to speak about some of those provisions, particularly financial provisions around Article 6. That includes surplus retention, reallocation rules, new ineligible and eligible expenditures, new funding categories, as well, obviously, as your Schedule B and the budget. Tim will then take some time to chat about the new approach to outcomes performance reporting and the performance management framework, and then we'll wrap up and talk about next steps. Okay, so now I'd like to take the opportunity to work through at a fairly high level the 25 provisions in the new contract template. So I'm going to ask you, if you have your contract template in front of you, to refer to the first section, which is the definitions section. As in all contract templates, and certainly in previous versions of the PDD contract template, there are some key terms that are defined throughout the contract. And these are signified through the use of capitalization. So any terms that are capitalized in the contract are defined in the definitions section. So we'd encourage you, if you come across a capitalized term in your contract, to refer back to the definitions section for clarity. I'm not going to take time to run through all of those definitions, but I do want to touch on 3 that either have particular significance or are new in this version of the contract template. So the first is the term affiliate. And I will speak a little bit more to this later, but it really relates to the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act and how that applies to contracted service providers. So to clarify, the FOIP Act only applies to government bodies or government entities. So as a service provider through your normal course of business and outside of the contract, you are not subject to FOIP or the provisions in FOIP. However, for the purposes of FOIP, given that you are under contract with the government of Alberta, you are considered an affiliate. In other words, if you are collecting personal information for clients as part of your services agreement or your contract with government, the rules of FOIP also apply to you. This is why within the FOIP provision, which I'll get to a little bit later, there's a provision requesting that you refer any FOIP requests on to the province for handling. So I'll speak a little bit more about that as we go. Just wanted to highlight that. The second definition I wanted to touch on is the service request. So as most of you will know, I suspect all of you, in early 2016, Human Services implemented a new pre-qualification request process. And that required that all contracted service providers across our programs and services needed to go through a pre-qualification process to be considered qualified service providers and to therefore be eligible for work with Human Services. So you contracted service providers who are either listening remotely or participating in this webinar are likely already qualified service providers. And that means that the first step to entering into contract with you is that the province will issue a service request outlining the services and the estimated budget. That then triggers the process to enter into a contract. So again, just wanted to highlight the service request process. The third term that we wanted to speak about is surplus. And as you're aware, this is an item that has certainly generated a lot of discussion between the government and PDD service providers. Tim is going to speak at length about surplus and about how the new surplus retention provisions will work in practice. There's just one piece that I wanted to highlight and make very clear, and that's that positive variances that a service provider encounters during the course of your contract, and we are expecting to enter into 3-year contracts with PDD service providers starting April 1st. So those positive variances that occur during the term of that contract are not considered surplus and would not be requested for repayment to the province or return to the province. Surplus is only considered at the end of a contract term. So in this case, at the end of a 3-year term, there might be a discussion about remaining funds that are not expended in your contract, and there may be a request by the province to return those as surplus. Again, Tim will speak in much more detail to surplus retention provisions as we go. Pardon me. Okay, we're going to move on now to Article 2, which is term of the contract. As I referenced, we expect that the majority of contracts that we enter into for direct client-facing PDD services will be for 3 years, effective April 1st, 2017, and expiring on March 31st, 2020. I should mention that the question has come up at some previous sessions. If a service provider wants to enter into a shorter term agreement, say a 1 or 2 year agreement, is that possible? And yes, absolutely. I think you'll agree after we go through the material here that we believe it's really to the contractor's benefit to enter into a longer term agreement because it allows you a longer period of time to allocate and flex the funding to meet your organization's needs and to meet the needs of the clients that you serve. But certainly if there's a request to enter into a shorter term contract, that can be discussed and accommodated. Article 3 speaks to performance of services, and really the focus in this provision is about risk assessment, mitigation, and reporting. So we ask through the contract that the service provider advise the province of any changes in your corporate status. Now this is really focused on the financial health and solvency of your organization. Similarly, if a client is removed from the program for any reason, whether that be a decision that the client made or a decision that you, the contractor, made, We would also ask that you notify the province. And we'll use the term province throughout this session interchangeably with service delivery region. Really, the province, from your perspective, would likely be your contract specialist or contract manager that you work with. We also ask through the contract that the contractor notify the province of any occurrence that could result in significant risk or mental harm to a client. So again, you as the service provider have the expertise. You work with clients on a daily basis. You are in the best position to assess where there might be risk to a client. As per normal practice, we would ask that you maintain open dialogue with your service delivery region and your contract specialist to discuss where there may be some risk that could be assessed, mitigated, and ultimately resolved for a client. The next piece I want to speak to is criminal record checks. This is a new requirement in the 2017 PDD contract template. It reflects a common provision across our suite of contract templates, and it also aligns with an accreditation requirement under CET. So we would ask that every 3 years and initially upon employment, a criminal records check, including a vulnerable sector check, be completed for all those who provide direct services to clients. So I do want to emphasize that point. This is not a requirement for administrative staff or supervisory staff or management positions or even board members or volunteers who do not provide any direct services to clients. It only applies to those providing those direct services, but it's not limited to just employees. As you'll see in the contract itself, it references employees, agents, subcontractors, and volunteers. But again, this is to your discretion. If that individual is providing direct services, that's where that requirement for a criminal record check comes in. The vulnerable sector check, some of you may already be familiar with. It is typically an additional level of search that is included in your criminal record check, typically an additional box that needs to be checked off, assuming you're going through local policing authorities or RCMP. Where the results of a criminal record check indicate any potential risk, then the expectation and the requirement in the contract is that you as the contractor put in place reasonable precautions to address that risk. Article 4 speaks to minimum standards, certification, and accreditation, and basically spells out the minimum requirements that you as a contractor must meet in delivering the services that are outlined in the contract. You will note that in the appendices to the schedules, there is reference to PDD standards and policies. These will be provided to you in an online format with the contract template once you receive that as it's drafted. So this is really a similar provision that you've had in previous contracts and basically says, you know, the province has an obligation to provide any applicable standards and policies to you, and that the parties will work together to meet those standards, and where required, will work together to address non-compliance and reestablish compliance. Article 5 speaks to the program and services audit. Now, there are a few instances where the province may be notified or may initiate a program and services audit. The focus is really ensuring that clients are receiving appropriate services. We see this as more a mechanism for collaborative review and development of recommendations than as a disciplinary or punitive tool. And I think that already in practice, as has been practiced for many years, if there are areas of potential improvement that are identified, either by the service delivery region, by you, the service provider, or through potentially a report or concern expressed by a community member, family member, guardian, or other, then this provision allows for a process to enter into a discussion about how those areas of improvement might be addressed. So we are putting into place a formal process relating to what we're calling an Article 5.1 review. We have heard from some service providers through our discussions that there's concern that individual contract specialists or contract managers may interpret this clause differently and may call for a review or program or services audit without going through an appropriate and consistent process. So this new process will involve review and consideration and ultimately a decision by senior leadership within the region before any program or services audit is completed. Now, some of the instances that might prompt a program and services audit or review might include a critical incident involving a client. It may include a concern or a report that's received from a collateral member of the community, whether that's, again, a family member, guardian, the client themselves, or another practitioner who's providing services or involved in services to that client. Similarly, you as a service provider may identify an area that you are finding a challenge to meet in terms of an area for improvement. So that would be an opportunity, we would hope, for you to contact your service delivery region and discuss ways that you might be able to address that together. And finally, another example where this Article 5 might be exercised is if the province determines a need to conduct a full program review. If that's the case, that program review, depending on the scope, may include a review of sample contracts or potentially all contracts under that program. So again, another example where that broader provincial program review might extend to contracts and to you as service providers delivering services under that contract. I'm moving on now to Article 6, which is payment and finance. This is a substantial provision in terms of both length within the contract, but also impact and weight for service providers and the service delivery regions. Tim is going to speak at much more length about the financial provisions, including payment, invoicing, and financial reporting, but I did want to just touch on a few highlights. So the process for providing advance funds, as has been the practice historically with PDD, is unchanged with the new contract template. So that allows for the provision of 2 one-month advance payments at the beginning of the contract term. You'll see in your Schedule B that payments are now divided into 3 distinct components: direct service costs, indirect service costs, and ancillary program costs. Direct service costs are really your frontline costs that are directly related to individual referral confirmations. Tim will speak in much more detail about those service categories and funding categories as we move on. Monthly allocations for those 3 categories of funding and invoicing against them is preserved, so that normal practice for monthly allocations and invoicing remains unchanged with the new contract template. Remember, we're now looking at a 36-month term rather than a 12-month term. So if you're invoicing against your initial budget, then it would be a 1/36 allocation each month. And Tim is going to again speak to much more about invoicing practices. This new contract template also establishes parameters for what's considered eligible and ineligible use of public funds. This is standard practice across Government of Alberta. You'll see in the Schedule A that there are charts relating to eligible operating, eligible capital, and eligible ancillary program cost expenses, in addition to a handful of ineligible expenditures. We've also added in some specific timelines in the contract for around invoicing, and particularly around notification by the province to service providers should there be an error in an invoice. So we heard from service providers some concern that it was important that efficient and expedient timelines were put in place for notification on errors of invoices. So we've added in some specific provisions around that, which again, Tim will speak to in more detail. Finally, the surplus provision, which I did mention, we have added in new provisions around surplus retention, particularly the need to return surplus at the end of a contract term. Again, that is after expiry of the contract and not during the contract term. Much more detail to come on surplus retention as we go. I do want to speak to one particular provision in Article 6, and that's Article 6.8, which we call repayment or re-execution of services. So in your current 2016 contract, there is a similar provision that basically allows a mechanism to have a discussion should there be concern that a client has not received services for an extended period of time in the contract. This has been the subject of much discussion at the negotiating table. And the original provision has been revised pretty substantially to reflect the ebb and flow nature of PDD services and more adequately reflect the reality of the PDD service context. So if it is determined that a client has not received substantive services and their service outcomes have not been met, the province may request repayment of those services depending on the circumstances. Now again, this is one of those examples of an exceptional circumstance clause. We don't expect that this would be exercised often. If it is, it would be subject to review and approval by senior leadership within the region. I want to speak to just some of the scenarios where there might be a discussion between the service delivery region and the contract about Article 6.8. This is not intended to apply in those cases where a client is periodically not receiving services, whether that be because of vacation, hospitalization, potentially a client is incarcerated for a period of time, or receiving therapy or other services from another provider. We know that the reality is, in even some of those instances, you as a service provider may still be providing services, whether that's full services or limited services. It's not always a black and white situation. This is where we would encourage a discussion and dialogue, as has always been the practice, between the contractor and your contract specialist. It was really important, and I need to highlight it, that this is not just about a period of time. This is not about whether a client has not received services for a period of time. It needs to be considered also in light of the impact on service outcomes. So that's why we have this reference to substantive services and service outcomes. So if a client goes through an extended period of time where they're not receiving services, but their outcomes are still being advanced as intended, then this clause would not apply. So again, just to highlight, it is about length of time, degree of services provided, and impact on outcomes for that client. I'm going to move on now to Article 610, which really is a mechanism for service providers to request additional funding from the province in urgent, extraordinary situations and or situations where a temporary adjustment to a service model is required. So you likely have and will continue to encounter situations where a client perhaps has entered a crisis point for whatever reason, and there is a need to provide additional services on a short-term basis. We heard from service providers that it was important to you that a decision on that additional funding be provided as quickly as possible, because we know that the reality is you do not have the luxury of waiting for a decision from the province. You are often and typically already providing services in those extraordinary and exceptional circumstances. So what this provision does is it outlines a timeline for the province to respond to those requests. And if the response is a decline of your request for additional funding, that be provided as promptly as possible and within 5 business days, unless circumstances warrant otherwise. And the reason that we as government asked for that caveat in case additional circumstances warrant otherwise is that we understand that in some cases, those requests for additional funding need to prompt a discussion with other parties. That might include family members, guardians, other community members, or practitioners, and that we cannot always control the timelines for those discussions. Having said that, we would expect that in the very large majority of cases, those responses would be provided very quickly so that you can then update your budget accordingly and make service plans accordingly for the clients that you're serving. I would also add that this provision requires that the province provide written rationale for its reason to decline a request, should that be the case. Okay, moving on now to Article 7, which speaks to requirements around records and reporting. There are 2 pieces around reporting, and that's been the case in previous contracts. So financial reporting and service or outcomes reporting are both requirements under the contract. They're set out in the schedules of the contract, and Tim is going to speak in much more detail to those requirements around both financial reporting and service or outcomes reporting. I do want to just highlight a few things relating to Article 7. As per previous practice, financial records need to be retained for 10 years. This is the common Government of Alberta practice and requirement across Government of Alberta contracts. In terms of financial reporting, an auditor's report must be provided within 90 days of termination or expiry of the contract, and annual consolidated financial statements are required within 90 days of the contractor's fiscal year end. There also may be a request at any time by the province to conduct an independently audited financial statement or auditor's report at any time during the term, although we expect that this would be largely on exceptional circumstances. Again, Tim will speak more to these reporting provisions for both financial and outcomes reporting. Article 8 speaks to original notes. Again, this is one of those capitalized terms, so it is defined in the front definition section of your contract. I'll just refer now to that definition. Original notes means any records which are made, generated, produced, or acquired by the contractor or its employee, subcontractors, or agents with respect to a client of the program. So these are essentially the client-specific notes or case notes that you as a contractor maintain through the course of the contract term. As with previous practice, those original notes upon contract expiry or termination need to be returned to the province because they are in effect the property of the province. We have added in a provision in Schedule D to allow for a contractor to request copies of the original notes, recognizing that there may be instances where you require those notes for reference, whether that be potentially future legal action where you're required to defend a position and provide information, and therefore you would need those original notes to reference. So again, Schedule D allows a provision for the contractor to request copies of original notes, and the ministry would provide those as quickly as possible and not withhold that information. Article 9 speaks to non-assignability and subcontracting. So this is, we do actually need to make a revision in the contract template itself because right now there's an error in the wording, so we're going to be doing that very shortly. Basically, current practice and historical practice around subcontracting is maintained. That is, you as a contractor are able to subcontract for services as you choose and at your discretion, and that does not require prior approval by the province. However, we are asking, just for the purposes of information sharing and risk mitigation, that you identify your intent to subcontract any of the services in Schedule A. So again, this is not a requirement to list subcontractors by name, whether that's individual or organization, but rather to express or identify your intent to subcontract. So for each of the service categories or service areas in Schedule A, you'll see that the next version of the contract template that you receive includes a note to please identify an intent to subcontract. If you do retain any subcontractors, as per normal practice, you as the contractor remains responsible for the provision of services. Moving on now to Article 10, which relates to key positions. This has been the subject of much discussion at the negotiating table, and I would say one of a handful of provisions that really garnered a strong reaction in the initial contract template that was tabled in the spring. So as originally written, this reflected a common Government of Alberta provision which really allowed for the province to determine where key individuals or positions required prior approval by the province to replace. This has been changed significantly through the course of our discussions, and as it's currently worded, the focus here is really on key positions. This is one of those examples, again, of a very exceptional circumstance provision. And let me just walk you through what we intend from this. If you as a service provider, jointly in discussions with your contract specialist or contract manager, determine that a key position with highly specialized skills, expertise, or experience is required to meet the needs of a particular client or client population, you would jointly identify that position in Schedule A. So there's a portion in Schedule A for that purpose exactly. Now, the reason is this, and I think it's easiest to walk through a scenario. If you, in discussions with the service delivery region, determine that a client or a group of clients requires the service of, say, a neuropsychologist in order to meet their very unique or complex needs, you would identify neuropsychologist in Schedule A. If for whatever reason neuropsychologist A ceases providing services for you, or you no longer have them in a subcontractor employee arrangement, and you choose to replace that individual with neuropsychiatrist B, you do not require provincial approval to do so. However, if you determine after neuropsychiatrist A leaves that you would like to replace that position with a psychologist, a behavioral specialist, or another position that has more generalized experience and not that level of specialized experience, in those circumstances, you would need to have a discussion with the service delivery region and come to agreement about whether that was appropriate given the specific and specialized needs of those clients. So again, we expect that in the large majority of the cases, there will be no key position identified in Schedule A. And in that case, Article 10 becomes non-applicable. However, on those odd circumstances where you do identify that a key position is critical to deliver those services, that's where you would identify that position in Schedule A. All right, thanks, folks. We're going to keep moving. We're now on to, oops, that's my slide. Okay, now we wanted to refer to Article 11 in your contract template, which is a fairly standard provision in Government of Alberta contracts and certainly in previous iterations of the PDD contract template. Fairly straightforward. It reflects the requirement for contractors to comply with all laws that may apply in the performance of services under the contract. So just for your reference, the 2016 PDD contract template did include a similar provision that was termed laws. Article 12 really focuses on material ownership and intellectual property. So this, again, is one of those standard template clauses in the Government of Alberta contract suite, but it does have a unique application, I think, in the PDD context. So just in sort of overall reference, material ownership relates to which party owns materials that are developed under the contract. We know that in the normal PDD context, you are delivering services and not creating materials or deliverables. So the application of this provision was questioned as we went through our negotiations and discussions. So we've added a provision in Schedule A, which is a placeholder to identify those exceptional circumstances where the province and the contractor jointly agree that in addition to the services that you are contracted for, you are also receiving funding for a particular specified material or deliverable or intellectual property. We know that in 99% or more of cases, this wouldn't be the case, but there are the odd and rare circumstance where in discussions, the province may decide to actually provide funding for a material in addition to the services that you provide. So you may be doing something very innovative as a service provider that we would like to learn more about. And so we may ask you to share a report, data that you gather through the course of delivering services, or other information about that innovative practice that you're testing or delivering within your organization for clients. If that's the case, then that material is specifically identified in the Schedule A. And that material then would become the property of the province after the contract term. I should note, and Tim has mentioned this in sessions, that there are cases where the province will provide funding for a particular deliverable or material, and then there, through discussion, is agreement that the contractor maintains ownership of that material or that it's shared. And that would allow the province an ability to apply it in practice in a more broad basis across programs and services. So again, just like Article 10, this is one of those circumstances where if nothing is identified specifically in Schedule A, the clause itself does not apply. Article 13 speaks to protection really of confidential information and requirements around disclosure and non-disclosure of information. So the gist of this provision is that information that is confidential and shared between parties in performing your services needs to stay confidential. So examples that have come up through the course of our discussion: you may need to share information about a client, whether it be a client risk assessment for the purposes of a rental agreement or the requirement that a housing authority may have. You may need to share specific client information with another member of the delivery community or another practitioner who might be providing services or, say, an assessment of a client. Now, in those kinds of cases where you're providing client information to another party strictly for the purposes of delivering services and continuing to promote better outcomes for that client, that would not be considered inappropriate use of information. The best rule of thumb that we can offer is that if you are sharing confidential information about a client for either your or somebody else's personal or private gain, then that would be considered inappropriate use of confidential information. I'm going to move on now to Article 14, which is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Clause, or FOIP. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, contractors, and this has always been the case, contractors who are under contract or under agreement with the Government of Alberta, or any other public entity for that matter, are collecting and using personal information of clients on behalf of the province pursuant to FOIP. So in the normal course of business, independent of your contract, service providers are not typically subject to FOIP. Again, FOIP only applies to government agencies or government entities. However, through the course of delivering services under contract with government, you are considered, as I mentioned previously, an affiliate for the purposes of FOIP. This really gets down to the fundamental concept around who owns client personal information. That information continues to be owned by the province. As a service provider providing services under contract, you are collecting that information on behalf of the province. This is why there's a provision in this Article 14 specifically about requirements should you receive a FOIP request. The contract spells out that should you receive a request under FOIP for information that you collect on behalf of the province under your agreement with the province, that FOIP request should be referred immediately to the service delivery region for handling. Now, I know that there's been some suggestion that, again, this is exercising an undue degree of control on the contractor, but I want to be very clear. This is about forwarding requests for information that ultimately is information owned by the province. I'd also hazard a guess that you probably don't particularly want to deal with a FOIP request because it usually involves a significant amount of work. Now, the question has come up through the session: what if I receive a FOIP request that is relating to information outside of my services agreement with government? Well, if that's the case, say you receive a FOIP request for information about another area of your operations or an employee, for example, then you've received that FOIP request in error because, again, as a non-public entity, you are not subject to FOIP. If you receive a FOIP request and you have questions about whether it pertains to information you collect under the agreement or other information, we would be happy to provide some advice on that matter. So please refer that on to the service delivery region. They, in turn, will get in touch with government resources that have expertise in FOIP and can provide an opinion on the suitability of that FOIP request and who best should respond to it. Moving on to Article 15, this is a standard provision, has been in previous contracts, and really speaks to joint indemnification and liability under the contract. So basically, it outlines a requirement that each party indemnifies the other for their own breach of contract or negligence or willful misconduct. It also indemnifies the province in relation to damage to the province's property caused by negligence or willful misconduct on the part of the contractor. Again, standard contract provision and typically very exceptional circumstance where this would be exercised or considered. Moving on to Article 16. So this speaks to the basic insurance requirements by a contractor. This has existed in your previous and current PDD contract. It outlines requirements related to general liability, automobile insurance, malpractice and errors and omissions insurance, as well as WCB coverage, that's workers' compensation coverage or equivalent. I should mention that insurance costs are an eligible operating expense, and you'll see that in Schedule D, and Tim will speak more to those expenditures and eligible and ineligible categories. Quickly, I did want to reference that we did consult with an expert in the area of nonprofit insurance that was referred to us by the Alberta Council of Disability Services, and she provided some suggestions to clarify some of these terms and provisions. So the version that you see reflected in the 2017 contract reflects those discussions and some of that clarification with that individual. Article 17 speaks to the relationship of parties, and as in previous contracts, it states explicitly that the contractor is an independent contractor and not considered an agent or otherwise. Contract stands on its own term and does not signify a continuing relationship. So these are highly complex and quite legal matters that relate to a relationship between a funder and a service provider, and fairly standard provision, again, in government contracts and in previous contracts. Article 18, another standard provision that speaks to how formal notification should be provided. And really the intent of this, as in previous contracts, is to be explicit that notices are formal written communications between the parties with respect to the contract. So in the normal day-to-day course of business, I know that you as service providers will speak via telephone, via email, or other forums with your service delivery region. That practice is not intended for this provision. This is really about if there is a need to exercise a provision within the contract, that notification needs to happen through formal written communications. Article 19, another of those highly exceptional circumstance provisions, speaks to termination and ability for either party to terminate through the course of the contract term. So again, either party can terminate without cause on 90 days notice. The contract may also be terminated at any time during the contract on mutual agreement by both parties. And there are circumstances, though they are exceptional, where the province may determine that termination is the most appropriate course if certain requirements of the contract aren't upheld, if there's significant risk deemed for a client, and or if there's failure to report on funding or the provision of services. Again, in the normal course of practice, termination would certainly not be a first resort. If there are issues around non-compliance or potential risk for a client, the first step would be a discussion between the service provider and the service delivery region. There may be remedial or action plans that need to be agreed upon and put into place. Suspension may be considered, and termination again would be a very last resort. So as in previous contracts, this provision outlines some of those circumstances that might warrant termination, as well as the obligations around notice on either side for termination. I do want to just emphasize here that through the course of our discussions with the negotiating table, it was important that in practice, if there's an intent by a service provider to not enter into a new contract, that notification about that intent be provided as soon as reasonably possible, and at minimum prior to 90 days of contract expiry. Similarly, if there's an intent by the province to not enter into a new contract with the service provider, in practice, we would be having those discussions well before contract expiry date. Again, those are very exceptional circumstances, particularly in an environment where we've heard direction very clearly from the minister that direct services under PDD will not be subject to competitive tendering. So in that scenario, we are looking at assuming the quality of services continues as it has, and the good work that you're doing continues as it has, that we will be looking at a 3-year contract term immediately followed by a new multi-year contract term. There are two new provisions within this Article 19 that I want to speak to, and really they focus on supporting the most effective and successful transition of clients in cases where there is a need to transition clients, whether that be because of termination or otherwise. So the first speaks to a consultation plan and indicates that prior to contract expiry or termination, the contractor will work with the province to develop a transition assistance plan for affected clients. In addition, contractor collaboration speaks to a requirement that should you as a service provider be transitioning clients to an alternate service provider, the expectation is that you would be there to provide support and answer questions from the receiving service provider relating to the clients that are being transitioned. So again, the intent and the emphasis here is really getting back to that Albertan at the center of the balancing exercise. How do we ensure that both parties work together to support the most effective transition of clients? And I'll address this because I know it will likely come up. It certainly has in other sessions. If it's determined that there is not sufficient time within the contract term to effectively transition clients, then a discussion will take place between the contractor and the service delivery region about other options, which may include a new short-term contract specifically to support transition planning and associated costs for those clients. So there is no intent to have a hard and fast drop-dead date where there's no negotiation around extension or new contract. It is in everybody's best interest that clients are supported through transition. If more time is needed to support that effectively and minimize disruption for clients, then that's exactly the type of conversation that should and would take place. Okay, Article 20, very standard provision, speaks to safety and security requirements. If as a contractor you are using province's facilities or equipment or hardware, you must comply with the associated safety and security requirements. Article 21, as per previous contracts, allows space in the contract to identify who the parties' representatives are for the purpose of formal notification. Again, this differs from your normal day-to-day communication and correspondence between the contractor and the service delivery region and relates specifically to those items in the contract that require formal notice or notification. Article 22 contains provisions around conflict of interest. And as per previous contracts and standard government contracts, there is an expectation and a requirement that the contractor should avoid any conflict of interest in the course of providing services under the contract. Discussion at the negotiating table about the term private interest. So conflict of interest is basically an incidence where an individual receives some kind of private or personal gain as a result of their actions. So in the past, we have used a definition of private interest that was mutually agreed on by the PDD Contract Advisory Table. Is that the right term? Contract Advisory Committee. Thank you. Provincial Contract Advisory Committee. And that's the table that includes representatives from the PDD sector as well as here in the PDD program. So that table determined and developed a definition of private interest that we've included in the questions and answers document. And basically what it speaks to is that private interest is considered an action that results in personal or private benefit to an individual or private citizen. That differs from the work that you do every day to advocate on behalf of your clients and advocate for service improvements within the sector. So the best rule of thumb here is if an action may be perceived as benefiting an individual rather than a client or advocacy on behalf of the sector, that would be where there may be consideration of a potential disclosure of conflict of interest. This would be an opportunity, I think, for you as a contractor to consult with your own legal counsel about potential conflict of interest. There is a process in place that this graphic helps to outline, and that's outlined in the article itself. So if you as a contractor become aware of a potential conflict of interest, the first step is to notify the province immediately and make that disclosure. The province would then take that information, review it, and access expertise within the government to determine if in fact there is a conflict of interest. If a conflict of interest is identified that is significant, the province may direct suspension of services, and that notification would be provided to the contractor within 5 business days. It's more likely in most scenarios that after reviewing and determining the potential conflict of interest, the province would respond that there is indeed no conflict of interest, or that it is of a minor nature and can be addressed through various actions. In very exceptional circumstances, the conflict of interest may be so egregious that it causes risk or harm to clients served or employees or otherwise. And in those extreme instances, the province may need to terminate the contract. Just to clarify, if you disclose a potential conflict of interest, it's reviewed by the province and deemed not a conflict of interest or otherwise resolved. You do not need to redisclose that conflict of interest. Moving on now to Article 23, Survival of Terms. Again, a standard provision in previous contracts, and it basically identifies specific contract provisions that survive or continue to apply even after the contract is terminated or expires. The last one I'm going to speak to before we take a break and then move on to the next module is Article 24, Dispute Resolution. So you may recall that in the first version of the contract template tabled in the spring, there was no provision for dispute resolution. This was actually pretty consistent with Government of Alberta service contracts. However, we heard very clearly from the sector that as important as a collaborative and positive working relationship is, it's also important to have provisions in place and a process in place in those rare instances where disputes cannot be resolved through the normal course of relationship and collaboration. And so we jointly with the contract template committee developed a provision around dispute resolution that you see in your contract. From a government perspective, and one of the differences from the previous PDD contracts is it was important for 2 things. Number one, it was important to have specific timelines identified for each of the phases of dispute resolution. We did not want, and I think service providers would agree, to get into long, drawn-out dispute resolution processes that may occur over months and years, where there's no resolution, significant cost to both parties, and likely an impact on services or client at the center of that dispute. So we have added in some specific timelines for each of those phases of the dispute resolution. Similarly, for government, it was important that the minister maintains final discretion to make a decision should those various steps in dispute resolution not succeed in actually resolving the dispute. So you'll see that those are 2 additions from previous practices around dispute resolution. From a service provider perspective, we heard 2 things. Matters relating to funding needed to be eligible for dispute resolution. Typically, in government contracts where there are mechanisms and provisions for dispute resolution, matters relating to funding are not eligible for discussion and dispute resolution. That was very important from the PDD service providers at the table, so you'll see that that exemption is not included in this template. In other words, all matters, including matters relating to funding, are eligible for dispute resolution. The last piece is that from a service provider perspective, it was very important that the dispute resolution provision included process for mediation. So you'll see that that's reflected in Article 24. So I'm just going to walk quickly through the steps. Again, dispute resolution in practice has not been exercised more than a handful of times over the past several years. So this is another example of an exceptional circumstance, but an important provision to have in place to allow for a formal process to resolve concerns or disputes. So first step is the standard dispute resolution process, a 21-day period that would allow for a formal request for dispute resolution and representatives from both parties meeting to discuss and resolve the issue. The next step, should that not result in resolution of the issue, is mediation. So if within 21 days dispute resolution is not successful, then the matter is referred to mediation. That mediation panel consists of a representative from each party as well as a mutually agreed upon mediator. If then within 21 days or another agreeable term, if that's agreed on by both parties, the matter is not resolved, then it would be forwarded to the minister for final decision and resolution. You'll see that we've noted that the minister will follow rules of natural justice and procedural fairness in determining final resolution. This was a request by ACDS Legal Counsel, and those are terms that have some significance and weight and precedence in a court of law to help frame how a decision should be made in these cases.